First of all, may I congratulate the Honourable Member for Garston and Halewood for securing this very important debate today. I thank her for her kind words about me, but I also congratulate her on a passionate and heartfelt speech. I agree with her speech. I will come on to the reasons why, but I would just like to say to her that she has been a fine and fiery champion for the Hillsborough families since she entered this House. And I'm only sorry that it has taken so long for us to get to the position where the Hillsborough families actually know what happened on that day, and where government should be in a position of taking action to ensure that other families do not suffer in the same way. In my time as Home Secretary and Prime Minister, I've dealt with a number of issues where victims and survivors, where bereaved families as a result of public disasters found that their pain and suffering was compounded by the fact that they then had to deal with the reaction of various organs of the state. Obviously, the Honourable Lady has focused on Hillsborough, but as the Honourable Member for Kingston upon Hull referenced in her intervention, that is not the only example of these situations happening. And too often, the public sector and government, which should be supporting bereaved families when there has been a public disaster, they should be on the side of those bereaved families, but too often they retreat into a defensive position. They put up the barricades, and the families, the victims and survivors find themselves not only having to deal with the aftermath of the tragedy, not only having to deal with loss and injury and all the other aspects of that tragedy, but also beating their head against the closed door of the public sector. That's in the criminal justice system and in other aspects of the criminal justice of the public sector. And of course, what this leads to is that adversarial situation where both sides grow increasingly apart and increasingly sense that the other is just against them. And this shouldn't be the case. But more than that, that adversarial situation makes it much harder to actually provide for the needs of the bereaved families. It makes it much harder to get to the truth as what has happened, and it hampers the justice process. Now, it was the need to change this situation that led me to putting the commitment in the Conservative Party manifesto in 2017, quote, to ensure that the pain and suffering of the Hillsborough families over the last 20 years is not repeated. We will introduce an independent public advocate who will act for bereaved families after a public disaster and support them at public inquests. But this is not just an idea, as we've heard from this side of the House. The Honourable Lady has been promoting this idea for some considerable time. It has cross-party support. It should have cross-party support from everybody in this House. Can I just say as an aside, I'm grateful to see the Chairman of the Justice Select Committee here on this. I'm only sorry that there aren't more of my colleagues here to speak on what I consider to be a very important topic. Now, that need for an independent public advocate was echoed later by Bishop James Jones when he published his report, The Patronising Disposition of Unaccountable Power. And he said, and I quote, "I believe that this report confirms the need for an independent public advocate in these circumstances, but to ensure that the pain and suffering of the Hillsborough families is not repeated, I would caution against the adoption of too narrow a definition of public disasters. As the report shows, many of the experiences of the Hillsborough families are very sadly also reflected in the experience of families bereaved through other forms of public tragedy where the state has fallen short." He did provide a charter for the public advocate. He also suggested they should be involved in ensuring that social work and other support was available to bereaved families, in engaging with the media to try to ensure that the bereaved were treated with dignity and respect, something that certainly did not happen in the case of the Hillsborough families. In fact, the very reverse happened to the Hillsborough families, but also in ensuring that bereaved families were kept properly and fully informed at all times. Now, this point of information, I think, is absolutely critical. Families want to know what is happening. They want to be informed. But actually, that can be a two-way street as well, because there will be occasions when it's important for the families to have full information as to why they can't have a particular piece of information. For example, if it would prejudice an ongoing criminal investigation. What matters is that there is that degree of transparency and not that feeling of cover-up. And critically, the independent public advocate must be, as their name suggests, independent. But they mustn't just be independent. They need to be somebody who can be recognised by the bereaved families as being independent. Because, to put it simply, the independent public advocate is there to be on the side of the families, to help guide them through the processes, to explain processes, and to get that information for them, including dealing, I would suggest, with breaking down any barriers to information that are put up by the public sector. None of us want to see any more public disasters that lead to the loss of lives, but as the Honourable Lady said, sadly, we know things will happen. And therefore it is, I believe, imperative that the government acts with urgency to put in place an independent public advocate. We took that important step in 2017. I'm sorry it wasn't repeated at the 2019 election. The previous Lord Chancellor recognised the importance of this issue, and I'd like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to him for the work that he did in government. He recognised the need for this role, and I hope that the incoming Lord Chancellor will do so too, because I am certain that introducing an independent public advocate is absolutely critical to ensure that bereaved families in future, as a result of public disasters, do not suffer in the way that the Hillsborough families suffered. But they have someone they can turn to in their hour of need, and someone who they know will be working for them. And if I may just say this to the government, it isn't just in the interests of those families. Actually, it's in the interests of the government and the public sector that this independent public advocate exists and is able to ensure that you don't get into that adversarial situation, that they can smooth the relationship between the two sides, and that they can ensure that everything actually moves rather more quickly than it does. So government shouldn't see this as whether or not they're giving something to potentially future bereaved families, but actually there's an interest for government to have this independent public advocate in place as well, and certainly that's what I would argue. And I would hope that the introduction of such a post would, over time, lead the public sector to recognising that they should not be defensive in these situations and to taking a different approach and stopping the cover-up mentality in the future. I did just want to raise one further issue, if I may, which is the reason why the most recent trials collapsed was because although it was accepted that individuals had doctored evidence, it was evidence given to what was an administrative function of the Home Office rather than an inquiry. Now, obviously, a public inquiry, obviously under the 2005 Act didn't exist at the time. I would just say that, obviously, if you take the logical sort of next step from that, it would be to set everything up as a 2005 Inquiries Act inquiry. Government departments have a natural reluctance to set up public inquiries, partly because of the cost, the length of time they often take. And we have seen through the Hillsborough Independent Panel that there are often other means of getting at the truth that can be equally beneficial and indeed in terms of process may be more helpful to all those involved. So I would just ask the Minister to consider whether it's possible for government to address this issue of the fact that something that isn't under the 2005 Act could lead to a similar situation again in future. But in order to keep open the options for government in terms of the types of inquiry that can be set up, whether the panel type or the 2005 Act type of inquiry. Yeah. But just my final point is to return to the issue of the independent public advocate. I absolutely agree with everything that the Honourable Lady, the member for Garston and Halewood, said on this issue. I think this is something the government should take up as a matter of urgency. I am happy to beat my place to the door of the new incoming Lord Chancellor once he's got his foot under the table to try and persuade him, should he show any reluctance, of the importance of doing this. The Hillsborough families deserve this. They have been through hell since that fatal day, and they don't want to see other people having that same experience. We owe it to them. Yeah.